Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this Friday afternoon for this exciting talk by one of our rising stars from the psychology program at LAU, Dr. Myriam Malhami Khouri. It's such a pleasure to have you here with us, Dr. Khouri, to share the outcomes, the surprising outcomes of your research, which was conducted following the explosion of August the 4th. And you've conducted some really interesting research that reveals surprising outcomes about people's reactions and the ways in which they have coped with the explosion. So we're really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you so much, everyone. At the end of this talk, we will have some room for Q&A, so please stay with us.
Thank you for this very nice introduction. I think it summarizes pretty much the important points that we're going to be tackling today, that I'm going to be introducing and sharing with you. And obviously, I would also love to hear what you have to say about it. Let me start sharing my screen. I hope it's clear to all of you. So today we're going to talk about mental health in Lebanon. Can the phoenix still rise? And I've asked you in the polling section to give me a quick answer as to whether yes or no you believe that the phoenix can still rise. I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes to fill that. And I'm happy to see that some of you, most of you actually, believe that the phoenix can still rise. And what I will hopefully show you is how we can incentivize the phoenix to rise. What resources do we have at hand to encourage this phoenix to rise properly? I start with a disclaimer because we're talking about a very sensitive topic that might be triggering to some of you, especially starting off with this image. Please, if you still feel this discomfort by end of the talk, do reach out to me and I'll work rapid ways with you to decrease or manage this discomfort. The reason we chose to keep this image is actually because this is exactly where the myth says that the phoenix rises from. So from its own burning ashes. And now that you have met the phoenix, let me tell you what science has to say about how does the phoenix really rise. The point of the studies that I'm going to be sharing with you is first and foremost to document the mental health of our fellow Lebanese citizen, young adults, in unprecedented times. Now, we're going to be focusing on the Beirut port explosion, but it's true that this came in very uncertain, unprecedented times. And the idea was for us to study mental health with two ends in mind. The first one being to identify those of us who are more vulnerable to the accumulating challenges and distresses, so that ideally we can outreach and provide support, mental health support, expert professional mental health support to these vulnerable people. And the other idea was to identify those of us who are doing better than others in those challenging, accumulating adversity times, to try to identify and perhaps include these resilience factors in our institutions. And when I say we, I mean we as educators, we as students, we as institutions, we as municipalities, we as policymakers. How can we make use of this information? Because we definitely know that although we are all in the same storm, we're not definitely in the same boat. Now, when we talk about the storm, I don't need to introduce or comment much on the socioeconomic and public health context in Lebanon. We're going to be focusing on the past 2 years. The region, the country has known lots of turmoil in its history. We're going to be focusing on what has happened in the past 2 years, with the social political uprising culminating in October of 2019, with the viral pandemic officially hitting Lebanon in February of 2020, and these are still ongoing adversities, challenges, events, distresses, in spite of all the efforts to properly target them and handle them and manage them. Then came the financial crisis with the devaluation of the currency around March of 2020, and the Beirut port explosion in August of 2020, the repercussions of which are still ongoing. Let me introduce to you also from a psychological concept, some very few important constructs before I show you the studies that we conducted. A few of our ongoing projects, actually. So the idea is we are wired as a human species to deal extremely well with acute stress. However, when stress is unprecedented, it means, now you all know we don't come to this life equipped with manual on how to respond to environmental changes. So we need to figure out ways to do it and predict the best outcome for an optimal response. In unprecedented times, obviously, this is impossible to do. Now, the COVID pandemic has been unprecedented, the socioeconomic challenges have been unprecedented, and by all means, the catastrophic explosion has also been unprecedented. Under such conditions, what happens is our ability to cope is diminished because environmental demands outweigh personal resources. And this is exactly where we start becoming less functional. Less functional from a cognitive perspective. And by cognitive, I mean faculties related to thoughts, memory, attention. We become also emotionally imbalanced, very irritable, very moody, very sad. Our behaviors are altered, relating to our relationship to food, sleeping is altered. We tend to become perhaps more aggressive, more lethargic as well. And physiological changes are also an indication that we're doing poorly under stress, with increased heart rate, blood pressure, migraines, headaches, decreased immunity, etc. What's also important is that to understand from a psychological perspective is this resistance or resilience to stress is a direct factor of time progress. So at the beginning, we have an alarm phase whereby our initial response is halted for a while, so that we figure out what we are dealing with. And then quickly, our body mobilizes its resources during the resistance phase to deal properly with those changes. So if you remember during COVID, the first few days or weeks, although we were extremely shocked by the massive changes we had to go through, we nonetheless managed in a way to develop new realities that were quite enjoyable, in a sense that we started learning how to cook, do yoga, have virtual meetings, etc. So this was positive adaptation time, let me call it. But then as the stress continues, the idea is we're continuously depleting our resources and we're not replenishing them. So it leads to exhaustion. And this is something that we have documented for a very long time in psychology, and we know that it can go all the way to death, okay? In the past few years, tens of years, let me say, we have also been focusing, scientists in the psychology field have also been focusing on how can we, in this very dire time of exhaustion, reboost our growth strategies. And so not all of us, so this is not a fatality for us to continue going downwards. We can somehow reverse the trend. And this is what I'm going to be showing you in the coming few studies that I'm going to be sharing. Last context setting has to do with collective disasters, because these stressors that we are faced with, these ongoing unprecedented challenges, are not individual stressors, rather they are collective. So we're dealing with this as a collectivity. And what we know happens after collective disasters, whether it's man-made or natural disasters, after an original impact time, we go through heroic, or we call it the honeymoon phase. This is where the community gets together to try and deal with what has happened in very positive, optimistic ways. It is followed quite rapidly by the disillusionment phase, where we start really understanding and grasping the irreversible impact of this disaster. And we hit rock bottom. And this is probably what it feels like nowadays, that we are stuck and the situation is extremely bad. Now, that's the bad news. But the good news is that studies of collective disasters have shown that there are ways to move up back into reconstruction and sometimes even grow higher than the original pre-disaster well-being or status. Now, this is not a walk in the park. This is not a linear process. And I'm going to be talking about this a bit more in the coming slides. What I want to show you now is a few of the projects that we have ongoing. The idea is I'm going to show you what we did, what we found, and also what we learned and how can we apply this from a clinical, but also from a practical perspective. Now, we have not studied per se the socioeconomic, the sociopolitical uprising that happened in October. Colleagues of ours from the nursing department actually worked on understanding what happens, what do we go through when there is political uncertainty? And this happened in similar settings in 2015. What they did was ask around 300 of our students to measure scales related to stress, uncertainty, resilience, social support in relationship to well-being. And what they found is a very common sense finding, in a way, is that feeling or reporting perceived stress and being unable to tolerate uncertainty negatively correlates with well-being, negatively impacts well-being. On the other hand, having factors or agents of resilience and finding people around us to support us through these unstable times is positively correlated with well-being. And what this tells us is it's not so much the instability itself that threatens our well-being, but rather it's our interpretation. So if we perceive it as an opportunity for change, then we're less likely to be distressed, more likely to be optimistic and show positive mental health, as opposed to mental distress. And it is also correlated with the resources that we have. So perception is important, and availability of resources and social support is important as well to help us navigate these uncertain times. What we know about COVID, also our colleagues from the psychology department have documented the distress that we go through during times of lockdown. And this happened in the early stages. I'm going to say phase one, or I called it round one, because this was the first year of the COVID pandemic. Now, what we chose to do, and this has been documented in studies replicated around the world. So if you go to PubMed and look up studies on COVID, you have around 180,000 studies, 10,000 of which are looking into the mental health distress, and they're documenting increased distress. So what we were interested in doing after the first lockdown in Lebanon, which is around June, was to understand what has helped people navigate these challenging times. And so we asked around 350 adults to fill up questionnaires related to stress, depression, anxiety, and trauma. And these are the most documented mental health concerns or mental health psychopathology or symptoms or distress symptoms. And these are not fancy names. These are just the reference for the scale that we use, for those of you who are not very familiar with psychology. And we also asked participants about their practices of gratitude and their sleep patterns. What we found was the following. What you see in dotted lines are the cutoff for pathology, okay, above which we say that people are struggling with symptoms of stress, anxiety, PHQs, depression, and PTSD. What we found was that 85% of the people score above the cutoff for the distress. 60% of people have more than one struggle, depression and anxiety. And 30%, and these are high numbers, this means 1 in 3. So if I look at the list that I have, if it's not you, if it's the person before or after you in the listing. And these are obviously a lot of people struggling with these kinds of mental distress. This is positively correlated with age, meaning the younger you are, the more likely you are to struggle with these disorders. And it's also correlated with your employment status. So if you feel like you have an unstable job, or if you are unemployed, you're more likely during the COVID pandemic, during the lockdown, or after the lockdown, actually, to be struggling with these forms of mental distress. And so what we learn is this is not necessarily a sign of psychopathology as such, but this definitely says that the cost of adjusting to major threats is very elevated. And what we need to do is, if the cost is elevated, we need to provide resources. What could those resources be? What we know, what we also found out in the same study, is that although our sleep hours were unchanged, so we were sleeping around 7 to 8 hours per night, the sleep quality was impaired. So the closer it is to 10 and 15, the more impaired it is. And also our bedtime has significantly shifted. And this is something that smartwatch providers like Fitbit have also documented. So it's not just in our part of the world, all over the planet, our sleeping habits had shifted because of all those changes. And this is kind of counterintuitive, because we have more time at home, we have more time to take care of ourselves, and yet we are sleeping less well than we should. We found out that all these variables, including gratitude, were negatively correlated with viral infection. So this was the time where we had very high death rates because of the viral infection. And so obviously, if you were not contracting the virus, you were happier and you tended to be more grateful. And so your sleep would be improved. Now there's a bidirectional interaction with sleep. The idea is, if you sleep better, your immunity is improved. And if you're sick, you tend to sleep less well. So it's like a vicious cycle. It's related to gender, age as well. So again, younger people are less able to or have more altered sleep patterns. And they also tend to be less grateful. Now that could be either because they've been less exposed to adversities such as the COVID pandemic one, or less massive collective adversities on one hand, and on the other, it could be because their prefrontal cortex, and we're going to go back to that area in the brain, is less developed. So it matures around 25 to 30. And so this is the part of your brain that allows you to regulate your emotion and regulate your responses to adversity. It's also correlated to employment status. And this also reminds us that the financial pressure, even amidst a health pandemic, the financial pressure is still there. So what we found is that these factors, so sleep and gratitude, where sleep impairment positively correlates with mental distress, whereas gratitude negatively correlates. And more advanced multiple regression studies show us that actually sleep and gratitude are both predictors of mental health. And what this tells us is that very simple daily behaviors, like sleeping an hour earlier, going to bed an hour earlier, and I'm not going to be saying go to bed at 11, but if you go to bed 1 hour earlier than you usually do, it is going to definitely improve your mental health. And also attitudes of gratitude. So practicing gratitude, having a grateful mindset, also protects you amidst these very challenging events. So although the cost is very elevated, small, simple ways around this are based on daily behavioral changes. So that's one thing. Now, unfortunately, COVID did not subside. And what we have done is we followed up some of those people we had interviewed in phase 1. We followed them in round 2. So a year after the COVID pandemic, after the second lockdown, which happened in January, February of 2021, we also interviewed or circulated online questionnaire for 250 people, 50 of which were exactly the same as the first round. We also measured depression, anxiety, and PTSD. And we wanted to understand, a year into such tragic, unstable, unprecedented challenge, were these people able to grow? Or who were exactly what was the profile of the people who were still able to strive. Keep in mind that in the meantime, so between round one and round two, the financial devaluation had worsened. We had witnessed the catastrophic Beirut port explosion, and in spite of that was just before the vaccination. So a year into the pandemic, we still had no direct hopes of getting the vaccine. And the idea is, if I ask you, what do you think will happen to the mental health of people? So pre-pandemic, if I had told you that you were going to stay like a day or a week, or let alone a month or a year in lockdown mode, in altered reality kind of mode, what do you think you would have responded? If that was a week or a month, and if that was a year? And so maybe counterintuitively, again, what we found is the exact same prevalence rates of distress in May 20 and in March 21. Now, we're not directly comparing apple to apple because most of the participants are not exactly the same, although they're pooled from the same population. We nonetheless found that the frequency of anxiety, depression, PTSD, and stress was exactly the same between these two time points. And this also was the finding of colleagues of ours from a sister institution who, for example, worked on depression between these two time points. We have learned nonetheless that when we subjectively ask people whether their distress comes mostly from the COVID or from the explosion they had witnessed or from the financial devaluation that we were going through, the number one source of stress is the actual financial concern and financial instability. Now, when we pool these, so the more distress, the more sources of distress you have, the more significant is the intensity of your distress. So having more sources of adversity, financial, physical, or health-related, and then related to the explosion and the sociopolitical climate that comes with it, doesn't lead to more frequent cases of anxiety or depression, but it worsens the symptoms of distress for those who suffer from these disorders or from these symptoms. Now, here's the silver lining. The same distress, these same elevated levels of PTSD, which is a reaction post-trauma, so post-financial trauma, post-blast trauma, post-COVID trauma, can be one of the factors that leads to growth. So our predictive model suggests that when you combine gratitude, exposure to stress, initial exposure or response or elevated reactivity to stress, female who we know are more susceptible to distress, and having lost someone to COVID actually facilitates post-traumatic growth. So it's as if it's when you hit rock bottom, if you have around you resources that allow you to grow, you are capable to do that better than others who have not hit rock bottom. So losing someone to COVID kind of facilitates or leads the way or paves the way for you to find meaning amidst this collective distress, which is quite interesting to think of it. Now, this brings us to the study that we conducted to better understand the subjective attitudes of people after the Beirut blast. And the idea here was to profile how different were our responses, our attitude to the Beirut blast 4 months, so in December, 4 months after the initial impact. So we asked around 1,323 young adults, adults in general, aged 18 to 64. What was interesting in this study is that we have used novel technology whereby we asked our participants to indicate whether they agreed or not, so yes, no, or hard to tell, to a series of 60 statements along 9 dimensions, using an iCode neuron software. And so we asked them about negative emotions, so whether they were feeling anxious, sad, etc. Intrusive thoughts, so whether they had nightmares, whether they were distressed by sounds, avoidance, whether they avoided going to Beirut or they avoided reminders of the trauma. We asked them about personal damage, about overall country satisfaction, about their optimism and level of spirituality and faith, about community support, whether they feel they belong to a community, whether the community supported their needs, about job worries, so whether they had lost their jobs, whether they were worried about losing their jobs. And we also asked them about how frequently they use the media as sources of information or sources of soothing, so as coping strategies. And the reason I mentioned this is interesting is because we actually implicitly measured the response time. So the assumption was the following. If I ask you, what's your name? And you know that with absolute confidence, you're going to be more rapid in answering or identifying the correct response. As opposed to when you're not sure, when you're uncertain about your answer, you tend to take longer. So if I ask you, are you enjoying this presentation so far? Regardless of whether you actually say yes or no, the more confident you are about your answer, the faster you will be in responding. And so we track this response time. Our colleagues from the business school have already used this and published with this very novel, very innovative technology, and they use it in neuromarketing. And so this is a few of the interesting results that I'm going to be sharing with you. So unsurprisingly, 75 to 85 of the people we asked have reported anxiety and stress. And please do keep in mind that we're asking people who reside in Beirut, outside Beirut, and even expats as well. 80% of them had financial worries, although only 10% of the people had actually lost their jobs. And I remind you, this is 4 months after the explosion. And so what this tells us is the initial cost of adapting to such traumas is always extremely high. 70% of the people wanted to leave, and 60% of them felt less productive and helpless and even numb. This reminds us that trauma induces what we call survival mode, and this includes fight, flight, or freeze. And we see all those three responses in the subjective attitudes of the people or subjective experiences of the people. So fight means you have elevated levels of distress, anxiety, and stress. Flight means you want to leave. And freeze means you feel completely numb, helpless, non-productive. And so all three are normal, I'm going to say, survival responses to abnormal traumatic catastrophes. The second thing this tells us is, on top of the destruction and the damages and the death tolls and the physical injuries, a very important threat is the impaired ability of the survivors to function. So a lot of people become less productive, or at least feel less productive and feel helpless. And this is extremely important to attend to by people who are in charge of educational institutions, of government institutions, of supporting NGOs, of municipalities. It's extremely important to address this threat, because not only do we have a lot of damage, but also those who are supposed to fix that damage are unable to function. Now, another important aspect to keep in mind is that although 80% of the people are reporting distress, only 9% actually went to therapy. Okay, so this is in line with numbers that we have from, again, collective traumas and individual traumas in the world. Although lots of people struggle with mental distress, very few of them actually go to therapy. And this reminds us that we need to develop better institutionalized outreach programs, all right? And so this is another very important concern to keep in mind. The last aspect is that 80% of the people said they showed pro-social attitude, and a lot of them actually feared worsening of the situation, and they also reported worries that this would happen again. And these are extremely irrational concerns, obviously, because, I mean, never in the history of collective traumas has the same collective trauma happened twice. Now, the first statements had very low distortion rates, so the confidence was very high. People really knew that they struggled. And the last statements had very high distortions. And this reminds us that attitudes in unstable environments are inconclusive. People don't really know what to believe anymore. And let me show you how this translates in actual examples. So we've asked people if their lives lacked meaning and purpose. What you see is that 46% actually said yes, and 40% actually said no. But the confident yes and the confident no's are extremely low. And this shows you that whether people said yes, life had no meaning, or no, life still had a meaning, both of them were not very confident in their answers. And this reminds us that it's important when these collective disasters happen to have authority figures, trustworthy people, explain to the people, explain to the population what has happened and what to expect next, because people are very inconclusive in their beliefs. And this is an extremely important window of opportunity to work on the resilience factors that I'm going to be discussing in the next slide. It so happens, because we're talking about the Phoenix, that we actually word for word asked people whether they think Beirut will rise again from its ashes like a phoenix. 40% of the people believed so, whereas 40% or 38% did not believe, and 20% found it extremely hard to tell, which again, tells us that people are inconclusive in their belief systems after these collective disasters. Now, one thing they were very confident about is that they wanted to leave Lebanon. And most people who were actually confident about wanting to leave are the educated youth. So on top of the destruction and the death tolls and the inconsistent experiences or belief system when it came to anticipating the future, we need to address this confident willingness of the educated youth to leave the country. And this is absolutely important. Now, if you go to the overall result of the study, and if you go back to this idea of trying to profile and identify clusters of people who responded differently to the Beirut blast, so that ideally we could address their needs and their concerns, we found that around a third, a bit more, were very highly distressed. They had very high levels of emotional distress, sadness, anxiety, waking up in the night. They were very dissatisfied with the country. They were extremely concerned with job security, which again reminds us of the financial burden that we need to address. And they turned to media for comfort. Instead of turning to faith or other coping strategies, they actually turned to media, which sometimes actually worsened their symptoms. No single factor, demographic factor taken alone, were predictive of this cluster. However, taken together, younger age, being a female, being a student, having lost your job, and residing in Beirut, so of course, proximity to trauma exposure, taken together, all of these factors allow us to predict this highly distressed subgroup. And so the take home at this point is that media is important in the aftermath of a trauma to help the people and not reinforce their traumas. And taken together, demographic factors have higher predictive power to allow us to target the vulnerable population. Another third of the people were actually not distressed or traumatized by the explosion, but rather were completely dissatisfied with their ways of life. They had although they had less personal loss, they had the highest country dissatisfaction, a lack of sense of community, and very low faith and optimism. And what this tells us is trauma actually worsens pre-existing tendencies. So the people who tended to be assess and less satisfied with the country were the ones who showed most willingness to leave and most dissatisfaction with the country. And this also reminds us that mental health and socioeconomic factors are very much interlinked. And socioeconomical standards are part of our well-being, and they need to be attended or catered after humanitarian disasters. The last cluster was a more optimistic cluster, had least emotional overwhelm, in spite of having personal losses as well, all right, and personal damages as well, but had least emotional overwhelm, so was able to find resources to regulate their emotional distress. They had less dissatisfaction with the country, and their sense of resilience was not an individual one, and this is a trademark. It seems to be a trademark of the Lebanese population. The sense of resilience is a community resilience. It's a come-together effect. They had the least job worries, and they actually turned to faith and spirituality for comfort. And what this tells us is that the resilience factors are not only developed or catered or promoted by mental health experts, but rather the social support, belonging to a community, and financial stabilities are part of the ability to become resilient after such a devastating, catastrophic trauma. And they give people an optimistic view of the future. Now, last small study I want to show you before trying to wrap up all these findings is, because we talked about exhaustion at the end, the idea is we don't all get exhausted similarly. And so what we've done here, allow me to congratulate our school for incentivizing undergraduate research, because this is a study that was led by one of our brilliant undergraduates. We asked 250 students to differentiate those who were, let's say, on the front lines of viral infection. So the med students who were actually going to, or the nursing students who were actually going to the hospital, as opposed to students of the same age that were staying at home, supposedly safe at home. And we measured anxiety, depression, trauma, so PTS, burnout levels, so this is exhaustion levels, well-being, and internet addiction as well. And our preliminary findings suggest, counterintuitively, although you might think that going to the hospital with very little financial compensation, being exposed for 2 consecutive years to grieving, to losses, to pain, to suffering, knowing that the hospital has also withstood the shock of the August explosion, you would think that these students, these medical frontliners, would show higher level of distress. What we found is exactly the opposite. They showed the highest level of resilience. And this tells us that committing to action is very important for maintaining our mental health. And this brings us to translating these findings into clinical practice. So the idea is, because we were able to define, for example, people who were more vulnerable. So remember, after the Beirut blast, the emotionally distressed group were made of younger women who were still students, etc. We have partnered with Intisar Foundation, and we have delivered therapy, group therapy for those. We outreached this group of women with Embrace, and we have offered them supportive therapy, group EMDR therapy, which is psychotherapy. And because we know that protective factors for frontliners are very important, we have partnered with the Lebanese Red Cross, and we have also offered a year of support session for the rescuers who were actually on the front line of the exposure after the Beirut blast, so who were on site. And these were support groups. They were not therapy, they were support groups to boost these resilience capacities that they had. If you want to bring all of these findings down to brain wiring and neuroscience, because this is one of the other hats that I have, and I absolutely have to somehow insert a brain image in this panorama. And I'll be very brief, I promise. The idea is we have 2 advisors in our head. One of them we call the emotional brain. It's made mostly of limbic structure. It's uncontrollable and unconscious. The other advisor is a rational one. This is made of the cortical brain mostly, and this is the controllable one that allows us to, and very conscious one, that allows us to make decisions, memorize, focus, etc. When stress happens, when we're overwhelmed with intense, unprecedented, chronic stress, there's an imbalance between these two inputs. So there's no good guy, bad guy here, but the idea is one becomes extremely functional, extremely hyperactive, and we typically say in Lebanese, "Dawwa raseh," okay, and it takes the lead, whereas the other one becomes non-functional or hypofunctional, and we say in Lebanese, "Sakkar raseh." So we become extremely emotional and we become incapable of regulating this emotionality. We also say in Sam Badane because this also happens down the line. Previous studies that we had on MRIs of traumatized phoenixes' brains is that although we are wired for negativity, so to deal with acute stress, we are not wired very well to deal with this instability. And so what happens is an imbalance in brain structures with hyperactivity of the fear acquisition system located around the amygdala. It becomes more active, and a decreased activity of those prefrontal cortices, they become less active. Once this happens, we have physiological changes that occur, cognitive changes, behavioral changes, emotional dysregulation, and resorting to maladaptive ways to regulate, like substance abuse, for example. And we have an increased incidence of medical problems, including cardiac and cancer issues because of this overall decreased immunity. Now, the thing is, this is not a fatality, and we can still find ways to rebalance the two advisors in our brains by decreasing emotional hyperactivity and boosting, again, rational control. How can we do that? So if we go back to 4 billion years, which is the emergence of life on planet Earth, what it has told us is that the phoenix is wired to rise. Because of this fight, flight, or freeze survival mechanism centered around the amygdala, the phoenix is wired to rise. What 3 to 5 million years of humanoid evolution have told us is that we can choose how to rise. We are equipped with prefrontal cortices, and if we activate them properly with action and connection, so action and connection, we can choose how to rise and properly. Now, sleep, going to bed 1 hour earlier, our ancestors knew that. So we have the saying, "نام بكير وقوم بكير وشوف الصحة كيف بتصير." By reframing our mindset, تفاءلوا بالخير تجدوه, by finding stable institutions and stable jobs, and also by volunteering for the support of the community. So these are the action parts that our studies show definitely improve our rising capacities, but also connection is important. So finding a social community to belong to, الجنة بلا ناس ما بتنداس, this is what we say, and then connection with spiritual higher powers also improves our capacity to rise. What 6,000 years of incidences in Lebanon, in this part of the world, has shown us is that trauma, whether it's man-made or natural, is inherent to our situation in Lebanon. And hopefully what I've managed to show you in the past 30 to 40 minutes is that growth amidst adversity is definitely possible. And maybe we can look at February 4th, so the date of today, not only as 18-month post-trauma, but also as the date that was declared a couple of years ago as the International Day for Human Fraternity. And this is exactly one of the strongholds that will allow our phoenix to rise and rise properly and grow from all the accumulating adversities. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing. And if you have questions, comments, concerns, feedback, I'll be happy to hear you.
Thank you so much for this fascinating talk, so eloquently delivered and so well contextualized. I've certainly learned a great deal from it. And I'm willing to make one pledge, which is to try and get to sleep 1 hour earlier. than I usually do. You've given us so many helpful tips to try and cope with all the uncertainty around us. You've talked a lot about optimism and hope and gratitude, and I'm sure that everybody has found at least one or two action points that they will take away. It's really refreshing and heartwarming to see research trying to help us as we try to cope with uncertainty. And we're really looking forward to reading more and more scholarly papers that are coming out of your research. So we'll now hand over to our audience. If there's any questions, we will moderate them.